and with a with a focus on both the intersection and a population that is system impacted. Now, before I get started, Pastor, would you like to describe a little bit about the population that we're specifically speaking about in the works that we'll be visiting today?
Yeah, specifically, we are going to be talking about folks who are working directly with people who are formerly incarcerated in whatever capacity that is, if that is in a teaching artist space or if that is in a production space. So some of us are on the line teaching artists, some of us are creating productions where we are in collaboration with people who are directly impacted by mass incarceration.
Thank you, Pastor. And so the focus of today's conversation will primarily be the principles that we've developed and locate in our work when collaborating with system impacted individuals, again, really centering formerly incarcerated individuals and young people caught up in the justice system. But before we do that, we want to make sure that there is baseline information as to what we mean when we use the word trauma. And so for today's presentation, yes, we want to understand trauma as a singular and repetitive event that is both disturbing and distressing. But we really want to move beyond that definition to further understand how it exists in an individual's body. Now, more and more clinical studies reveal that a traumatic event is stored within a different part of the brain, which therefore leads to a different recall, which doesn't provide a cohesive narrative around the event. And so instead, what is recalled might be a spurt of information that can be activated by anything sensorial, anything that is in the environment. It could be a sound, a word, the appearance of a particular physical structure. It could also be a scent. And when that spurt of information then activates a psychosomatic response, it is disconnected from the original event. And so really what we want to think about more carefully are the ways in which an activation emerges in the body. Now, when I say psychosomatic, I am really naming two different things. That there can be a psychological result to that recall of a traumatic event, again, in spurts of information, which may affect the way a person interacts with another individual. It may impact their sense of trust. It may impact the ways that they inhabit a particular kind of space. It may also result in denial. There are a series of ways in which, as a psychological response, a person is inhibited by that traumatic recall. The other thing that we want to look at is the ways that, as a psychosomatic response, something is manifested physically in the body, in an overload of an individual's nervous system. So what are those physical responses that we might be able to be attuned to in a space as we're working with this particular population? And we'll spend some time there in a moment. And so when we're engaging trauma in our work and narratives that touch a traumatic experience, whether singular or repetitive, environmental or personal, we also want to study and therefore really proactively incorporate within our practices preventative measures that would prohibit a practitioner, an educator, an artist from reactivating trauma, re-traumatizing anyone in the room. And so we really want to focus on three different areas that in an engagement, in this case, in an arts practice, there are three risks of re-traumatization that I will describe. The first is that the engagement, the activity, And therefore, the ways that a traumatic event is being called up and or touched, that it feels unexpected or sudden. In other words, an individual comes into the room and is not anticipating in the process, in the beginning of the process, that their lived experience is going to be centered in the room. And that there might be something in their environment that activates them unexpectedly. The second is that during the process, the activity, the action, the collaboration feels uncontrollable, so that the group and or individual does not feel that they have agency in the facilitation of the activity. And therefore it exists and is imposed outside of them and is imposed on their psyche. And then finally, the third aspect, and there are many in ways in which an individual or group might be re-traumatized, but the third that we want to focus on is that toward the end of the process, there is not the mechanics nor the room for an individual or a group to process and or decompress. And so I'll recite those three again. That the action, the activity, the event feels unexpected or sudden, particularly at the beginning of a process. That during and throughout the process, it feels uncontrollable to the individual. And then finally, that there's no time and or mechanics lending to decompression and the processing of what just happened during the collaboration. Are there any questions at this point before we move forward? And please just unmute yourself because I can't necessarily see you. Do you see him, Major?
I can see, I see. All right,
I have a question.
please.
My question is, will this also be given to us as a slide so that we can study it?
So yes, to answer that question, yes. So we're recording it and we're going to post the video to YouTube, and the video will have these slides as you see them right now.
Okay, thank you.
Now, sorry, go ahead, Pastor. Now, an important note, when we start to talk about trauma-informed practices, particularly in the intersection of social justice and the arts, we want to be sure that we're not only speaking about preventative measures, that in the arts, the very power that resides in our practices are the ways that we actively work toward healing. And I want to emphasize that, and Pastor and I will emphasize that throughout the workshop, that it's not only the ways in which we can detect and be protective, but the ways that arts uniquely can work toward a space in which a group is processing and leaning into their own healing. And to describe that further, I'm going to share the following video. One second, y'all.
We have all experienced some sort of stress as children. Maybe it was a test you didn't study for, or moving schools and
1 second, I want to try to expand. Let me expand.
BetterHelp is customized online therapy that offers phone, video, and live chat sessions with your therapist, so you don't have to be on camera.
schools and finding new friends. Regardless, it's important to keep in mind tests you didn't study for, or moving schools and finding new friends. We have all experienced some sort of stress as children. Maybe it was a test you didn't study for, or moving schools and finding new friends. Regardless, it's important to keep in mind that a little bit of stress from time to time is healthy. It helps us grow and understand how to overcome problems we may face. However, when the stress response is triggered too many times, there can be lasting effects on the brain that carry on to adulthood. Stress plays a prominent role in the development of a child. The three types of stress include positive stress, tolerable stress, and toxic stress. Positive stress will show as an increase in heart rate and an elevation in stress hormones. It is short-lived and is triggered during minor stress experiences, such as taking a shot or being left in a daycare for the first time. However, with supportive adults to help them cope, children will gradually learn how to problem solve and deal with adversity, leading to the development of a healthy stress response system. Tolerable stress can be more serious. Perhaps you've lost a loved one or experienced a natural disaster. These types of situations can have potential for extreme damage on the brain, but with encouraging relationships, it will mend over time. However, things can get serious when the stress response gets triggered too many times. This threat is known as toxic stress. It is strong, frequent, and prolonged for a long period of time. The root of toxic stress can be numerous things, such as abuse, neglect, or violence. This type of stress will physically affect the brain, leaving certain parts rewired and changed. Toxic stress disrupts the development of brain structure and other organ systems, and it can even increase the risk for stress-related disease well into the adult years. The worse the experience in childhood, the greater the effects will be in adulthood. Toxic stress causes permanent damage on the brain, focusing on the amygdala, prefrontal cortex, and the anterior cingulate cortex, also known as the ACC. The amygdala, also known as the fear center, detects dangerous things in the surrounding area and tells the body to act. But it can become overactivated due to toxic stress. In other words, your amygdala is always telling your body that you are in danger, resulting in chronic stress, where one feels unsafe, fearful, and irritated. Furthermore, victims will often overreact to minor triggers because trauma sensitizes one's amygdala, meaning that fear responses are triggered by lower levels of stress. The prefrontal cortex, or the thinking center, regulates the stress response system by making things seem less scary than they really are. Outside of stress, it helps regulate our emotion and memory, as well as sensory processing, which allows us to effectively use our body in certain events, such as learning and problem solving. However, trauma causes the prefrontal cortex to become underactivated. Consequences of a damaged prefrontal cortex include difficulties with concentration, attention, and learning. This is because when we are under stress, cortisol is released from the adrenal glands on our kidneys. Cortisol is a hormone that increases heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, and muscle tension to prepare us to fight or run away, otherwise known as the fight or flight reaction. High levels of cortisol impair one's ability to think rationally or logically. So when our body is always thinking it is in danger, there will be constant high levels of cortisol in our body, affecting our ability to concentrate and learn. Connected to the prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex is also one of the structures damaged from toxic stress. Known as the emotion regulation center, it controls the affect regulation, the ability to control and manage uncomfortable emotions during a stressful moment. A damaged anterior cingulate cortex results in difficulties with regulating emotions. For example, if someone gets pranked, they could remain scared long after the joke ends. Childhood trauma can cause many psychological issues, such as PTSD, high stress levels, and depression. However, these problems can be solved with patience, love, and care. Research indicates that supportive, responsive relationships with caring adults as early in life as possible can help prevent or reverse the damaging effects of toxic stress. One of the safest ways to solve one's trauma is over time. It's a good idea to build confidence progressively and work towards a goal in which one can feel safe again. In addition, patient and loving adults can help relieve toxic stress, as these relationships will help build trust and a sense of community within the child, resulting in them eventually learning how to overcome their trauma. Recovering can be a long and difficult journey, but with enough patience, support, and care, one can finally be free of that burden.
For just $67, you can
Okay. Curious to the group, was there anything that caught you by surprise there in the room or virtual? Is there anything that felt like a highlight to you? Please just unmute.
I thought it made a lot of sense in terms of, or it made me think of conversations about trigger warnings. And it also connected to what you were saying about an activity or conversation unexpectedly bringing up trauma. So what the narrator was saying about, I don't know, the amygdala or the fear response being triggered by what might be a small stimuli, it all connects.
Yeah, anyone else? Thank you, Lizzie.
I thought it was really important to note that the video makes clear that one of the most restorative practices in like trauma-informed care is definitely creating trusting relationships. How that can be like a child having a trusting relationship with an adult can be the most restorative way to heal trauma. And I think that's important to note and remember.
Yeah, thank you. There's one particular part that that you're pointing out, which has to do with duration, that I think is a key component to what we're describing here. That in the work toward healing and the ways in which toxic stress can be reversed in the body and in the psyche, there was one thing that was specifically named as part of the process. Does anyone recall what I might be referring to?
Are you talking about patients' love and care?
Yes, and continue. Yeah.
Oh, you're gonna say something
Yeah,
else? Or?
keep going. No, go ahead.
Oh, it just seems like that those aspects can not only reverse but can also prevent the damaging effects.
Yeah, go ahead. Yes, I think what I'm also describing is, you might have seen that it was an image of a calendar, that healing is active and it's continuous. And often in our work, we set a goal, or we maybe foolishly believe that healing is a one-time event. And instead, I think what is critical in our understanding of trauma-informed practice is that in moving beyond preventative measures and in creating a caring community in which individuals in a group believe that they are safe and that they have a sense of belonging, that work toward healing is ongoing. And that healing is always a verb, something that is active and needs to be elicited over and over and over again. And so the next question in this first area is, what is trauma specifically in the population that we are describing today? In a system-impacted population that has experienced incarceration.
I'm gonna stop sharing the screen, trying to ask you.
For the slides.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you. I saw someone else also put in the chat safety.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. So yeah, just wanted to bring that to the table as well. So I think that's the good thing about today. We'll be covering, you know, trauma specifically with the population that we're talking about, but this is information that can be used universally. You know, trauma shows up in a lot of different spaces. It even shows up with us in our daily lives, and it shows up in the most discrete ways. And a lot of times we're not able to identify it, nor are we able to process it or manage it when it comes from other people. You know, and as facilitators, as lead collaborators or co-lead collaborators, sometimes this will be our responsibility. If we profess to want to work in this area, then we have to deal with the trauma that sort of comes out of the issue that we're sort of fighting against, if that makes sense. But I wanted to speak specifically, what is trauma from incarceration, and what does that look like in day-to-day functionality? So research shows evidence that incarceration has negative psychological effects. Has negative psychological effects on people in prison. So we've at the Confined Arts conducted some research in partnership with Exodus Transitional Community. We did this in 2021, and I think the pandemic actually shut down our last 3 participants. So we were mid-research when the pandemic started. And that research was really looking specifically at the role that prison played on people's ability to sustain relationships, develop new relationships, and be able to subsequently navigate social obligations post-incarceration. How does prison set you up or not set you up for that? Based on the qualitative research that we conducted, we did find evidence that the deprived social environment of prison can potentially impede one's capacity to navigate various social obligations post-incarceration. So sometimes we see that and we're not, it's like, when we hear it, it's like, duh, but we don't recognize it for what it looks like in real time, and it's processed the wrong way. So just wanted to bring some attention to that. But on a day-to-day basis, it looks like what Sean mentioned, toxic stress. Some of the qualities that we can notice in specific trauma that comes from incarceration is a dependence on institutional structure and contingencies, hypervigilance, interpersonal distrust and suspicion, emotional overcontrol, alienation, and psychological distancing. So alienation and psychological distancing. Social withdrawal and isolation, incorporation of exploitative norms or prison culture, because prison is a very exploitive place. And to thrive, you have to take advantage in some capacity. And sometimes those life skills, because they become life skills, especially when a person goes to prison in their teens and they come out in their 30s and 40s, they've literally grown up in and have grown into lifestyles and have grown habits. And sometimes this is how it shows up. Also a diminished sense of self-worth, and personal value. And the traditional post-traumatic stress related reactions to the pains of imprisonment. So there's a lot of different ways in which prison can impact people. And as you can imagine, us having intersectional identities, this will certainly show up different in a man than it would in a woman, or in any person, period. Especially if we were to even bring into the conversation transgender people who have to go through a binary system. What kind of trauma does that set up for folks, right? So all of that, and it looks different for folks post-incarceration. So I'll stop there. If you have any thoughts, questions, you want to weigh in, please do, and then we'll transition to the next part of the discussion.
And actually, next part, we're going to open up the floor.
Okay.
We have lots of practitioners in the room, both virtually and in person. And so for these next 3 prompts, we want to collectively see how we have thought about the following in the spaces that we've worked in. So this first one, how important is it to be informed about the environment? And by that, we mean architectural, physical environment, in all the ways that an individual senses their environment. How important is it to be informed about the environment you're teaching and or producing art in? We're thinking specifically about the aesthetic and environmental impact that may activate an individual or group. Any thoughts? How is it that you assess the environment that you're entering into with your work?
Are you asking activate the trauma or activate the healing?
Activating the trauma. Thank you. Thank you for the clarification.
Okay. I feel like the environment is extremely important as certain situations, especially when you're going into a space that's unknown. And if there's too much activity, too much stimuli, too much going on, and they don't have a full trust of everyone in the space, it can become a little overwhelming. And how the space is lit the noises outside the space, the inspirational aspects within the space, such as art or whatever. They need to really see the progression as to what they're about to do versus what they're in the moment, because they have to slowly graduate into it. It's not all at once. You can't, you can't be happy, happy, happy and just come in, with this happy environment all at once, because they have to slowly gain trust. So that is
Beautifully said, Sharon. And thank you for pointing specific lighting out, which is something that I think is often overlooked. And there's one thing else that I want to pull out and hopefully we can expand on. When you start to indicate sensory overload, so the things, whether it's of a decorative nature or aspects of the project that an individual is about to join into, can you describe, or anyone else describe, what might lead to sensory overload?
Sensory overload would be too many people at once, or too many personalities. Some people are more outgoing than others. It could be noises outside, or police sirens, or people constantly being loud outside, because you're always on defense. Like you're always worried that something is going to happen, and you're trying to absorb the people. You're trying to absorb this new space. You're trying to absorb everything that's going on outside. And then you're trying to learn whatever it is that you're being taught at the same time, which you may not even be accustomed to or used to. So all of these things are happening at once. So this is why, like, lighting and kind of like a separation from the outside world and creating a different type of environment is important, because not everyone learns the same, and not everyone is going to react in the same way.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Anyone else? Environmental or aesthetic impact.
I think there's an impact on like how easy it is to leave the space. That's something I always think about. That like first putting the emphasis on that a person can leave that space if they feel the need, and that's up to them to decide at all times. So like even if that's just having the door open, or like close if that changes the space. Where you as a facilitator are in the room with the space. Are you by the door or the exit, or are you like back where maybe they wouldn't have to pass you? Because that, like you do hold power as a facilitator, and that can like be seen as something. So that's something I always think about.
Thank you for bringing in space, the power that you have in space as a facilitator. You kind of got ahead of something I wanted to go into later, but this is something that you have to acknowledge. And participation in justice spaces are interesting, because part of it is like folks are mandated to some extent to participate, even if it's voluntary. It's like, I still have to do this to meet some other requirement. So that weighs a lot in on, how I receive the facilitating, so yeah, I won't go too far, but thank you for bringing that power because it's evident.
I would add.
Go ahead, Curtis.
I would add that that the layout of this and considering in advance where the facilitator is going to stand or the teaching artist is going to stand, how you think about the structure of the lesson, right? Not just the lesson, but also like the seating, where the table is going to be. Thinking in advance of where the art supplies are going to be set out so they're easily accessible. So maybe you're helping to mitigate any external issues by the facilitator blocking whatever those issues could be by standing in a particular position. So the focal point is on the teaching artist, so everyone can focus on the lesson and learning as well.
Beautifully said, Curtis. And I also want to extend our thoughts about the physical space and that environmental impact to think about what occurs beyond the space where we're actually conducting our activity. The journey to the space also has an impact on the collaboration. And so how are you considering co-regulation of someone's nervous system and the ways in which they enter the space from the moment they're leaving their own home? So how are we then allowing for time to process the subway ride over, for example? And then by extension, quite often we forget the ways in which, particularly in the intersection of arts and justice, how many museums and that sort of grandiosity of the architecture actually mimics institutional architecture that for these individuals has only been oppressive. And so in considering the moment they step into a museum, for example, and how that journey therefore impacts the way that they will participate.
We have a hand raised.
T.S., am I saying your name correctly?
My name is pronounced Thais.
Thais, thank you.
I feel like what's being talked about now also addresses the second and third questions, because I think when you're working in a space with any new individuals in education, a more justice-centered practice is to establish norms of the space. And then this allows participants to know what to expect, but also allows them, not creating rules, but allowing them to shape the space as well, how they want to be treated in the space and how they wish to treat each other. But of course, being facilitated, by the individual doing the workshop or the teaching. And then I think also that has to do with, because there's so much dysregulation in being a traumatized individual or an individual who has experienced trauma. And that's just a part of like the cortisol and PTSD. I think it's really important to integrate mindfulness in terms of having a space to come into the space and become regulated, to regulate one's nervous system, something like deep breathing, meditation, mindful visualization can really help.
Thank you so much. And thank you for leading us to the second question. And again, let's open it up to the floor. How can establishing boundaries, collective boundaries, and privacy elicit voluntary participation? So if the goal is for there to be participation, collaboration, that is determined by the group, how can actually establishing boundaries and privacy lead us to a more productive space? And what do we mean by boundaries and privacy in an arts practice? Also to you. Yes, Ron.
It means the right to not disclose information.
The right to not disclose information. Anything else?
Yeah, or like to not participate, to step out, to that engagement is totally voluntary and optional, and there's really no consequences for not engaging.
Beautifully said. So there are three key things that you've already described. It is disclosure, and so the ability to withhold information. There's also the ability to opt in, but also therefore opt out at any point in the process. And then finally, I'm going to forget what you just said.
I forgot it too.
But it'll come back to me. But I think the piece of it that we really want to lead toward is how that feeling, that sense of safety that allows someone to say to themselves, okay, if I step in, that I also have the option without consequence, it was the third piece, to bow out at any time that I feel activated. That actually enables trust to be built in the room. And with that trust as a starting point, you actually have more collective buy-in for a collaborative process. Is your hand raised again, or I'm sorry?
Yeah, it's raised again. Something I'm wondering about is like a middle, because of what was said about often people who have been incarcerated, or there's like there can be coercive aspects of participation, or maybe someone is participating to get like something signed for social work or whatever. I'm wondering about the middle space of participants being able to opt out while still getting credit for participating or whatever else may be a part of the program for them.
That is a great question.
I think where we are today, that's not the case for most people. Like you will need to get that credit for participation. So I think in this, we're hoping to sort of place the onus on the facilitator and or producer or leader to understand that folks are in these tight situations. So facilitate a space that's more about cultivating the healing and the capacity building and all of the resources or tools that they can get from that space versus just trying to push a curriculum or push an hour of information that we've gathered. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think this is crucial, especially when we start to prioritize in the context of art production, when we overly prioritize outcomes or output versus process. And so as a facilitator, where is the space for alternative versions of participation? Are you predetermining and pre-designing how a person participates in a practice? Or is it something that is more open-ended and therefore can be opt-in, as Roland said? Are there ways in which there's visual manifestation, writing, physical participation, that all connote someone's presence in a project? And I think this is incredibly true for our work here at Recess, in which many of our young people are mandated to be here. And so there is something hanging over their heads in terms of, if I do not participate, then. And so how do you remove those consequences in a process and allow for people to show up differently and in their own ways? And this is something we'll actually revisit later on. But for the sake of time, I want to move to the third one, which also points to certainly the assembly curriculum, but the ways in which we negotiate a space. And then, as Rowan said, also start to co-regulate with our participants, with our communities. How does trauma show up in the body? Now, I didn't have this planned, but given I feel like we have some good, I'm feeling a good presence. Rather than describe this to one another, I'd actually prefer all of us to show each other how they might have seen a manifestation of trauma in the room, in an individual or in a group's bodies. And so what I'm going to do is count down from 3. And do you all see, do they see the full screen, the gallery screen right now?
No,
Can you
you would have to stop sharing.
1 second.
Unpinning.
Yeah, go for it.
So you see gallery.
No, it's
You
over
can
here.
switch your view to gallery view just so you can see everything.
Please. Everyone switch to gallery view.
If you're at liberty, it would be great if you turn on your camera, but if you can't, that's it.
All right. And what I'm going to do is ask each of us, and in the event that this is entirely new to you, you may opt out. But if you have been in a room in which you've detected some sort of energetic activation, and I personally, I should clarify, use the word activation over trigger, because I think activation is more precise in terms of how an event or an overwhelming sense of overactivation in the nervous system, how it actually wells up in the body. It actually is a gradual process, sometimes rapid, but rather than thinking about it as a trigger, as a one-time deal, the ways in which that might well up in an individual. And so what I'm going to do is count down from 3, and I'd like for each of us to embody through a single silent frozen gesture how they have seen trauma manifested in another individual's body. Okay, does that make sense? Give me a thumbs up or a head nod in the virtual space if you're with me. Yeah, all right. And in the room, yeah, cool. All right, in 3, 2, 1. Now, without moving too much, try to take a look and gather more information around the room, see what other folks have had to offer. And in particular, try to land on one gesture that seems to be calling your attention for whatever reason. Unfreeze. And so, hope you don't mind, but I'm going to just, for the sake of time, ask some people to sort of describe what they saw in another individual's body and the ways in which they believe that was a manifestation of trauma. Emily, how about you?
Emily, hello. I saw a lot of closed off, Kate, a lot of covering the face, of hiding. I saw that in KT and in Sharon. Something, yeah, closed, hidden, unwelcomed.
Thank you, Emily. A sort of protection, a sheltering, a hiding in many of our gestures, and quite literally a covering in some ways. That KT, certainly Curtis, Sharon, someone else. Let's see, Victoria. Could you pull out something that you noticed?
Yeah, I also saw in yours, Sean, you were kind of like dodging. And I think that has to do a lot with even what Emily was saying, like the withdrawing that we often see in the people that we work with who might have experienced trauma. There is a withdrawing that happens really consistently.
Thank you for pointing that out and also describing it as such, a withdrawal. So often in our practices, we believe that participation looks like active collaboration, where in a self-protective mode, someone may simply look passive, may look disengaged, but it quite often could be actively listening.
Yeah.
And taking in information. Is the way that trauma is manifesting in their bodies. Someone in the room, anyone?
Yeah.
Hannah.
I saw a lot of kind of like falling backwards into a chair, almost like lowering the center of gravity and kind of creating a necessary, I think, to sit up and to be open is a very vulnerable place, and oftentimes to come closer to the ground in an effort to feel more grounded can be a mode of self-protection. So I did see a lot of like almost as if trying to settle backwards and lower yourself.
Right on. Thank you, Hannah. Why don't you take over, Pastor?
Cool. So let's move on. Any other thoughts or comments on this? Please fill up the chat. Definitely use that space. I'm gonna move us along just so that we can stay on schedule. I know we have a lot.
You go ahead and share screen and I'll figure out this. So.
Can you all see my screen?
Yes. I mean, we get
it. Cool. So, you guys, I appreciate this conversation. I was really excited about today because this is like the meat and potatoes of how we do the work. It's the mindfulness. It's actually the love that we, that TLC that we pour into our work. And that is the difference between the efficacy of our work and the impact that we have on the lives of others through our work. So I'm really appreciating this conversation. So thank you to everyone who is weighing in. And if I'm not talking loud enough, let me know, because someone just let me know how to use my outside voice. So I will do that. But I wanted to shift us more into the process. There's a term that we've sort of been, I don't want to say sort of, we've been developing in the Confined Arts. It started years on this course, if he remembers the beginning of the creation of this term. But we've been able to build this out through the work we've been doing with the Berkeley School of Music and through a course called Lyrics and Change. But it's called Full Participation in Artistic Production. So I want to walk through a few qualities of what this concept means. It's a concept that was geared towards those folks who are working on collaborative projects with other people, with people who are formerly incarcerated, and they may not be formerly incarcerated or directly impacted by the issue. But there's a lot here that goes a long way for folks who are on this call who are just, who are, I don't want to say just, but who are also teaching artists. So part of the courses a lot of times is that there's a production at the end of it. There's some sort of final culmination of the work that you've been doing over time. So in the same way, a lot of these qualities will still resonate and still apply. So full participation in artistic production is a process of collaborative art making that includes the perspective, aesthetics, and insight of people who are directly impacted by the content of the final production. This process is collaboratively creating, this process, excuse me, of collaboratively creating art is rooted in cultural representation, ensuring that aesthetics and messaging of an artistic production uphold the integrity of the people who share that lived experience. And this is very important because historically, there has been artistic content created about people that has not been created by those people. And in doing so, this has led to huge amounts of misrepresentation, as we'll see in just another slide or two. So 3 qualities that I wanted to just briefly go through for full participation. One is active listening. The other one is representation. And the third one is collaborative leadership versus inclusion for quarter, as we would call it. Firstly, so I'm sure, I'm not sure, I don't want to assume everyone has, but you might have come across this information in another space similar to this, but we wanted to look back at the resources provided by Coactive Coaching on active listening. So I wanted to just really briefly just walk through some of just these 3 levels of listening. We can open up the floor for 1 or 2 thoughts after this, but I wanted to open this up regarding listening, and more importantly, how should we be listening for trauma? Right, so level 1 listening primarily to yourself or what's going on in your head. So the key, the key on level 1 listening is you're not really listening to what's being said to you, and you're really just like in your head at the moment. So people are talking and you're thinking about lunch, you're thinking about you gotta pick up the kids, you're thinking, you may even be thinking about something they said, but it took you somewhere else and you're not actively listening presently to the words that are coming out. Level 2 listening is more intensely focused on what the other, not so much on what the other person is saying. Excuse me, it's more focused on what the person is saying, nothing distracting you. Your thoughts about the past or the future don't intrude, so you're like present. So this is what we say when we're like, are you present? You know, even your ideas, your thoughts, somebody say something, oh, you know, when you could go there with your thought, you don't, you stay present with the conversation and what you are hearing. You know, this may seem easy, but presents a challenge as we're humans and our brains go places. We hear something that may prompt a thought, it may prompt something, oh yeah, I heard this before. Or it takes a second, probably a millisecond for us to get distracted. You know, when we are distracted, we lose time in the conversation. So it would be like, huh? Say that again? You know, and that's where this comes from, because we allowed ourselves to become distracted while, you know, good, bad, or ugly, we allowed ourselves to become distracted while we were listening. So the understanding of this level of listening will help us to identify when it might happen, to be able to prevent it from happening. So we want to lessen the amount of time that it happens, right? I mean, we may not be able to eliminate it completely, but over time we'll get better at listening with level 2 listening, right? But level 3 listening, this is probably one of my favorite forms of listening, is not just listening to what's being said, but also listening to how it's being said. Now, this is also a way of paying attention to body language, you know, and the majority of what people will say to you will be through their body, especially when you are, and I'm going to say this as a person who's formerly incarcerated, because I still do it, I find myself doing it at times. A lot of times we will communicate through body before we'll say it, right? But that's just with humans, period. You may have what might be presented to us may impact us physically, as we said, how does trauma show up in your body? It may pose a reaction in my body, and I will actually respond to what you just said in my body, but may not articulate it the same way. So if you're level 3 listening, then you saw how my body responded and you heard what I said, and maybe you can take it a little deeper. Maybe you can help provide me with some language to connect what I said to what I just felt, because maybe I don't have that or know that. Because this is important as well, right? Just because I have the trauma I experience don't mean that I understand it fully. So sometimes part of the healing is being able to connect the dots on what's happening. So listening, creating that space where I know that, as a former incarcerated person, I am being heard, and not just, I'm not just talking. You're not just giving me space just for the sake of time, to kill time, but you're actually listening to hear your concern. Which brings me here. How should we listen for trauma, right? So here's some different forms of the way we do listen. Sometimes we listen with a biased perspective. So it's biased listening, right? We listen with our own preconceived notions, right? We already have we already believe something about a certain person or maybe a crime. This is something, thank you. This is so important. This is very important because I think that folks forget this, and I want to keep this at the forefront of everyone's work. As you are working with people who are justice impacted, people go to prison for different reasons. And before you step into this work, you have to prepare yourself for the fact that you may come across people who have committed crimes that stand against a lot of your own personal morals, your own personal values. And that's not a bad thing, but you have to understand that before you go into the work. Because if you don't, then you may run into this, or rather you may be presented with this information, and then it changes your perspective, or your own trauma shows up and is now communicated to someone else about what was expressed to you. So this is important, right? If you want to have spaces where folks are opening up, you might hear some things that are like, wow. So you have to be able to understand your trauma, understand your own limits and boundaries before you go into the work, and understand that everybody who went to jail will go to jail for a non-violent crime. Some people went to jail for very violent crimes, and they did it. That doesn't mean that they didn't change over the time that they spent in prison, but it is what it is. And we have to acknowledge that and understand that going into the work, and that, not to, it's easy when we be in these bubbles of advocacy to act like everyone was always a good person. If you met Isaac 20 years ago, I wasn't who I am today. So it's very different. We need to understand that as we go into the work. Does that make sense? Everybody? Sure does. Cool. So we're just going to transition back into this. So biased listening. Sometimes we're listening with preconceived notions. Sympathetic listening. This is that listening where we're listening and we're showing understanding. It's very similar to empathetic listening, because you first have to show understanding to be able to demonstrate, a shared experience. And what that really just means, empathetic listening is really like, one thing I like to always say is that we have shared experiences. So you might not have been to prison, but I'm sure you can remember a time when you felt isolated, you felt oppressed, you felt taken advantage of, you felt exploited. So you may not be able to identify with the fullness of the incarceration experience, but there are parts of it that as human beings, we share experience. So being able to empathize with that feeling when I tell you, I did my time, and I didn't have the woman that I was with left me, and I was going through a period of intense loneliness. You don't have to go to prison to be able to resonate with that feeling of intense loneliness. There might have been times where you might have lost a parent or a loved one or someone near and dear to you, and you can resonate with that experience. Bring that up, bring that into the space, because it shows folks that you have listened enough to then interrogate or come to some form of relation to be able to say, okay, I understand where you're at, right? And I can demonstrate that shared experience through this example, right? Critical listening. This is that note taking. This is this form of listening is important because it allows us to point out the important, I don't want to say important, I want to say the main points of what a person is saying. So sometimes I tell folks this is something I've learned as a minister. Sometimes folks will take a whole hour of talking just to say one thing. You know, so you have to listen to what people are saying, right? But you have to care not to, because a lot of it is just them being able to become comfortable with what happened.
That's right.
And be able to express it. And then at the end of it, most of the healing comes in them talking about it, right? So I'm just listening to the point. So it sounds like this is what you're saying. And that was the conclusion of what they were saying. So I didn't get caught up with all of the points that might have not been as significant, but I highlighted the main points by listening critically. So I also want to say that we want to do all of these things with adults. We don't want to, I don't want to act like critical listening is like the best kind of listening. Right. It can have its disadvantages, but it goes a long way to understanding or being able to sift through a lot of content if you are taking notes, if you are like trying to pull out the nuggets, the main points of what you're hearing through that level 2 and level 3 listening, right? Information gathering. This is you listening to get wiser, you know, to get wisdom. You know, sometimes we step back from our own knowledge and just listen for the sake of understanding. You know, just because you've heard it before doesn't mean you know it. You know, so it's important that we are able to listen for the sake of information gathering. Another form of listening is appreciative listening. This is I want to say I guess we can this for me I feel like may not be the best kind of listening because it's more like you're listening for entertainment. So it's like the wow. So you know how folks say. So for me personally, I'll tell you, I don't share my story a lot in a lot of spaces because folks are usually always caught up on the wow factor. Oh, you went to jail, this is what you went to, this and that. And it's like, you're not really hearing what I'm saying. You know, you're just like, oh, you don't look like you've been in prison. Your head is somewhere else. You're not really with me on why I wanted to share that information. So sometimes we're just listening because we like to be entertained. You know, we want to kick our feet up, eat some popcorn while you tell us the story. And this is real. This is how we operate sometimes with folks. We want to just kill time, you know, so we just listen. You know, we don't really care much about what's happening. We want to be entertained, right? Selective listening. This is that distracted or biased listening, right? But the most important listening, and some of these qualities flow into that, is the rapport building listening, which is that listening for building trust through listening. And that's what we want to be doing. We want to be level 2, level 3 listening for the sake of building rapport with people. We want to be able to hear what they're saying, be able to communicate to them that we hear what you're saying, and this is how I understand it. Is that what you're saying? And allow there to be that engagement so folks can further clarify and we as facilitators or as producers can gain more information. Because even for me as someone who's been in prison, when I work with women, for example, I'm not a woman, so I don't know what the experience of incarceration is for women. So listening, I gain understanding more about the incarcerated experience. So with that, I'll any thoughts, comments? I know I said a lot in a little bit of time, but we're sort of speedy dating with this information.
Yeah, let's look at the case studies, maybe.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, so one last thing I'll say there is
Maybe to this one, yeah.
I wanted to say something about the listening. You can measure your own listening by how you respond to what you are hearing. So keep that. If you're wondering how am I listening, how are you responding to what you are hearing, right?
Do you want to touch on these before we move on?
We can. I don't know how much time we
have. We got 15, 20 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can. Do folks have any thoughts? Because there's like 2 more components to this.
We see you, Jeremy. Not a problem.
Yeah, unmute your stuff on.
No, he has to jump off.
Okay.
That's all.
Okay, cool. So let's keep on.
Yeah, let's touch on the other ones quickly.
With also this concept of full participation is also what I mentioned, representation. You know, it's imperative for art practitioners working in justice spaces to understand the historic relationship between dehumanizing language and music and stereotypical racialized media, as well as iconic imagery, and how different forms of representation have and continue to influence America's present visual culture. This is important because a lot of folks don't have access to people who are formerly incarcerated, or I don't want to say have access to people who live in different areas of the country, live in different communities, and don't on a day-to-day basis interact with different people. So representation and how we show people and represent them in popular media and through the arts is highly important. The last point I want to make is really important. This is the fullness of the full participation concept. Collaborative leadership versus inclusion for quota. So collaborative leadership means that you are ensuring inclusivity at every phase of the artistic production. You're also recognizing and prioritizing the unique perspective of each stakeholder involved in the production. So if this is the classroom space, then that's in the classroom space. As it relates to the production or the final production it positions all stakeholders to be co-leaders and change agents. And that is the complete opposite to inclusion for quota, which is just checking off the box. Oh, we have someone who's formerly incarcerated here. We have the perspective of people. We listen to them. We ask these few people. And now we're taking that information and we're going into our bubble to work on it without the co-leadership of the people who are actually being impacted by this content. So with that, yes, I'll come out of that.
You want to touch on the dehumanization piece real quick?
Please. Yes. Should I?
Yeah, you can speak. Yeah, cool. Do that one real quick.
So transitioning out of that, mark any questions, anything you have, throw it in the chat. I know I said a lot about listening, representation, and how we work in collaboration versus working through a quota. So if you have any thoughts, throw it in the chat, please. But I wanted to touch on dehumanization specifically in the work in two ways. The power of language and affirmation when unpacking difficult subject matter, but also the dehumanizing process. And this is something that was mentioned a little while earlier about the process and what are you putting people through? Is this process going to re-traumatize people? As it relates to dehumanizing language, some things we should keep in mind is that labels have impact. Research shows this. Labels have impact on the people who are receiving the label as well as the folks who are using the label, right? The folks who are receiving the label, they begin to inmate. It then produces a form of self-condemnation, and this is who I am an inmate. So you will hear folks come home and refer to themselves as inmates because this has been a label that has been pressed upon them. And also using the overuse of the word it also impacts the person who is using it because they then begin to only see the person that they're dealing with as an Indian, because that is the label by which they're using to consistently refer to them. Language can also be excluding. This is important. You know, we may be real articulate with what we're talking about in our spaces as we're delivering information, but that may be leaving a lot of people out of the conversation. So we're using words and we're talking at a level where folks may not have that education level. They may not be privy to that jargon that you're using. So being mindful that you're not excluding people, which can be dehumanizing. Language can be misrepresented, as I mentioned a little while ago. Misrepresentation also comes through language, and one of the ways that shows up is in fear mongering, right? Representing people through language in a way where it scares other people about them, or it isolates a demographic of people in a way that fosters an emotion about them, which is non-productive. The language you use, as I stated, shapes the relationships we are able to forge with people. And lastly, the dehumanizing process. So something that we should consider in our work is the process of engaging in your work re-traumatizing people, right? Is the content you are using or exploring to accomplish your goal re-traumatizing, right? And this is important. It's important that we possibly maybe share curriculum, share materials with other folks and ask and get feedback on, hey, how would this resonate with you if you saw this in this particular space? Is your presence, I heard this mentioned earlier too, is your presence, Curtis mentioned it, is your presence or inherited authority re-traumatizing? So how are you positioned in a room? Is everyone sitting and just standing over people walking around? What is the demographic or the setup, the makeup of the room? Is there a circle? Can people see that power shared in the room? What is that? So again, I said a lot, but I did get through everything. Thank you all for listening to that, Sean.
Yeah, let's bounce out of the screen share so that everyone in the room can see the full. Beautiful. So this is what we're going to do, y'all, for the final 10, and for those of you that can stay along, maybe 12, 15 minutes. Pastor and I are going to move through, let's say, 3, potentially 4 case studies, and therefore test your active listening. And what we will ask you is to call up any of the principles that you believe to be present in the case study or lack thereof. If there's anything within the description of the project that you believe might lead to a re-traumatizing effect. And so when Pastor and I recall these projects, what we will attempt to do is remove any language that might place judgment on the work, and therefore only offer you factual information as to what the process and project was. Okay, I'll go first, and this might be tough. Are y'all in virtual land ready? Yeah.
Can we take notes at the same time, or are we supposed to just listen?
No, you please take notes, and then we'll sort of popcorn style throughout the physical space and virtual space as to what you detect in the project. Okay. So first case study, school setting, high school population. Half of the students in a classroom of 26 students have been impacted by migration within their own families, in some cases their own, and therefore have experienced the criminalization of their movement, of their migration to this country. In a writing and visual arts project, a few of the students who have experienced the criminalization of their family's migration are asked at the outset to verbally describe their experience or their family's experience of having arrived to this particular place. They are asked to do so from their seat in a traditional classroom arrangement. They are then asked to describe the full trajectory and how they feel after the experience, or what the experience has been of their family members. That information is then utilized by the full classroom as a prompt for a writing project that is intended to be 4 sessions long. At the culmination of the first session, what the group has arrived at is only an initial few lines privately written without any group activity toward the end of the first session. What do people hear, detect? Where would they place the principles of what we've just gone over, or lack thereof? Both spaces. Izzy.
Should I just say one?
Just, yeah, 1 or 2, yeah.
Yeah, well, a big one is that they don't feel like it's a choice in talking about their story, and they have like no issues. I imagine they feel like they have no issues with that situation. Also, just the immediate activation of their trauma in that is significant down.
Two very important points. Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone in the virtual space?
I think, oh, sorry.
Go for it.
I don't know.
Go ahead, Dad, go ahead.
We're Sharon, go ahead.
Is she, you can go, I cut you off, go ahead.
No, go ahead, I'll wait.
I was, first of all, that was a lot for one person to have to go through, especially because they have been made, I don't know I forgot the term that was used, but they have been made the center of attention, and their boundaries have been challenged. Not only have they been made the center of attention and their boundaries have been challenged, they are now the subject, like a product and a, like in this thing in which they did not ask to. So they have been put on the spot, the boundaries have been challenged, and now they have to relive the actual trauma of what happened and retell this story multiple times and hear other people retell it without the other people actually viewing it or living it. So it's like 6 or 7 or 8 things happening at once. And this is a high school student. So after this, they may not speak. They may not interact. They may not raise a hand. They may not, even come to class because everyone knows their business. And I state that as a person that has happened to me. Like it literally, everything, like most everything that you said has happened to me because I grew up homeless. And it was brought to the attention of the entire class, in front of the entire class, that I was homeless. And now everyone knew that I was homeless, and everyone knew I didn't have money for lunch, and everyone. So that class, I would try to avoid. Either I would sit all the way in the back, and I wanted to learn, but I didn't want to bring any attention to myself. So, that's just a lot for a child to unpack. I don't know if I answered the question. I don't know if I responded correctly, but that's that.
Absolutely did. And specifically, I appreciate the way that you also described the resulting impact and the ways in which that individual, as was in your lived experience, then withdraws after that moment for having been put on the spotlight unexpectedly. And so it's both the overwhelmingness of the process, the unexpected nature of the process, and then something that you named, Izzy, in which it actually didn't lead to a collective processing or individual processing because it's used as a prompt for further exploration for later sessions. So at the culmination of the process, there's also no space of care. Pastor, next case study. You want me to do another one?
Yeah, because we have so we can do that.
Okay. Okay, second case study. We have a project cited at Alcatraz, former prison in off the coast of San Francisco. It is collectively led primarily by one practitioner with no incarceration experience and 6 individuals that are formally incarcerated. They meet for 2 months prior to the activation in Alcatraz to develop a co-design of the physical project, but also to establish a working process amongst the members. On site, what is exhibited is a series of large-scale, almost monumental alternative IDs in which collaboratively each individual selects an identification, an image, and information that they would wish to share about themselves in the reentry process as opposed to their criminal record. The images, the large scale IDs, are then used for a prompt, for a week-long community-led activation with grassroots advocacy organizations, inviting multiple stakeholders to the site to specifically think about policy change within the reentry space. Anyone? It could also be positive. Go ahead, Izzy.
Well, I'm wondering if the people who were participating in the project, as in people who were asked to choose an ID, if they were part of the conversation afterwards.
Great question. Great question. I don't think I have the answer. Great question, right? So what is their agency in the follow through, right? So that's an important question. Anyone else? Yes. Hannah?
Yeah. I feel like one thing that felt positively trauma informed, I believe, not knowing all the ins and outs of it, but was the fact that the center of the project was about what they want to be shown about them, not about what is being shown. So that's like, and in an ideal world that people are opting in to be a part of this artistic process and they have agency of telling the story that they want to be told versus a story that is often told about them.
Well said, Hannah. And very important piece to pull out. Anyone else? What did anyone, yes, they did.
I think just the fact that you mentioned there was a 2-month process at the beginning with shared collaborative leadership indicated to me that like there was space built into the process to be responsive to anything that may have come up and like enough time to be able to adjust or actually like give people the space to process. So that seemed like a positive aspect for me.
Beautiful.
Thank you for that.
Also, I think in that vein, recognizing that there, kind of what we were talking about earlier, that there was time built, that healing is not a singular event. And so there was an ongoing conversation in reaction to the exhibition at Alcatraz that indicated some kind of ongoing conversation, opportunities for ongoing processing and legislative change in reflection of this the kind of event and exhibition that happened for a long time or was put on for kind of a temporary period.
A time-bound period.
Yeah.
Well said, Anna. Thank you for that. Did anyone that did something come up for anyone in this room at the mention of Alcatraz?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Did anything come up for anyone at the mention of Alcatraz as a venue, as the setting?
Oh, so that would be the, like the same thing we were talking about, how the museums, the environment can cause someone to shut down because it reminds them of where they came from, where they're, you know, like what they're leaving, and they will be reliving the trauma again. Is that what it was?
Yeah, so there's the potential of that. And I think what was critical in this project is that the 2 months of convening and therefore co-design and co-creation occurs off-site. And so there is an attention to what that physical architecture might do to the individuals that are being centered in the project. But the question therefore still remains, to go back to what you pointed out, Izzy, what is their agency once inhabiting that space, and how are they centered with care throughout that period, which very much focuses on policy change. So yes, their voice is critical, but what about the sensory environment? How much agency can you have over that kind of physical architecture? And I can say as a practitioner, this has been really critical in the understanding of my work, as one of my largest projects did re-inhabit decommissioned jails and courthouses. So how do you actually establish agency in those spaces? That's a critical question to ask well before you move into those physical spaces. Yes, Hannah.
Question kind of in relation to that. Alcatraz for me elicits a lot. Well, clearly Alcatraz is this like locus for tourism and kind of has this like entertainment using like the carceral state to like for our own kind of like, oh my gosh, stories happened and crazy crime and whatever. And so I wonder at the efficacy of that space in particular, recognizing that broader reach, and I think the risk that comes with that broader reach. And I remember the previous workshop that you led a couple of months ago was kind of in conversation about when you're reaching a larger audience versus a smaller audience and being in control of that audience. And I think for Alcatraz, particularly folks who are visiting the venue are able to, there's more individuals that are able to experience that, but also you're in less control of kind of the response from the population or the intention that the population who's engaging with the exhibit has. So it just is bringing up questions for me of like, what is that is that a useful thing to have that broader reach and to potentially engage folks who normally would not be able to experience that institution through that lens, or is there harm in that as well?
All great questions. And there is the Disney effect of something like Alcatraz as a setting, because it has so frequently been part of our popular cultural visual landscape of the prison system. And so is there a loss of intentionality? And if so, how do the practitioners actually re-engage with that risk? So in so many of these, and I encourage you all, and we're running out of time here, I encourage you all to think about in your own work, how you would locate both the opportunities to really embed these principles in your work, but also where there is risk. There are times where we have to engage risk in our work. Physical surroundings, sensory overload, lack of agency, the time that we might not have to pour into a bonding with a group. These are all factors that you have to encounter and critically deal with in your practice. I mean, for those of us that are working at Rikers, for example, there are some very clear restrictions and limitations to how you might embed these principles in your work. Or you might be in a situation where a project is severely time-bound. So how do you prioritize a slowness and opting in when you only have a week? What if you do have the pressures of production? What are the ways in which representation therefore becomes a risk? What are the ways in which audience exposure becomes a risk? The goal here is to assess how you can continuously move back to the principles that you wish to locate in your practice, and always reassess the ways that there is loss, risk, threat, but also what you wish to prioritize, even with limitations.
I would add to that, ensuring that the spaces you cultivate in your work are healing spaces. To go back to the main point of all of this is to be able to get a better sense of mindfulness around trauma, so that we can produce more workshops, more projects that facilitate healing, that don't just advocate for, but also create healing in the process. So it's not just the work we're doing, but the process, how we're getting things done. So the ends don't always justify the means, and it can't in this situation, because a lot of what we learn about the work is in the process of doing the work. So we have to be mindful of that. I would also say in that that's very contrary sometimes to how funders put pressure on you. So one of the things that I try to do, especially in articulating the work is expressing the need to take a particular process and respect that process. So if that's not a process the funders are used to, then you articulate it to them in your presentation. This is the process we're taking, and this is why we're taking that process. Because you are the one doing the work, they're funding the work. So it's important that we continue to educate philanthropists on, how this work needs to get done. That way, when you come with a non-traditional approach, it's not looked at like skeptical, but it's looked at as innovative, if you will. So this is important.
Beautiful. So thank you all. For those of you joining me here at recess starting next Tuesday, really look forward to re-engaging all of y'all. And we will be moving from a place of pastor's point of active listening number 3. The way, with the argument that there are particular experiences and events that can't possibly be articulated through verbal language. And therefore, in order to prioritize healing, one must prioritize how things are expressed through the body. And it also leads us to believing that certain types of change, both community, on a community basis and on a system level, must start from the body. And so we will toggle back and forth from that type of methodology, looking at the ways in which verbal language can actually be set aside and that we can connect through our bodily expression and our bodily knowledge. We'll toggle back and forth through that assembly curriculum and the broader principles of arts engagement as system intervention, as we've been studying through this series of workshops. So I look forward, we have a full room starting next Tuesday, and we have a series, and that will be a series of 3 workshops. And I look forward to seeing you all very soon. Right on. Thank you all in virtual space.
Any final thoughts or comments? Anybody want to leave anything in the space before we go? I know we unpacked a lot and it's a lot to process. We will have the video up by tomorrow or later. And I'll email you all so you can just go back through it. But yeah, any parting words? Anybody want to leave anything in the space?
I think that this was a very informative workshop, and I appreciate the video that connected the actual scientific connection between the brain and trauma. I learned something there, so thank you. I just want to say thank you.
Thank you for being here.
I also wanted to chime in and say hi and thank you. My name's KT. Hi, everybody. I'm the youth and community organizer here at Recess, so I'll be with you throughout the rest of the trainings, just really looking forward to it. And today I was definitely a participant that learned a lot, and I really appreciated this. And it reminded me of what I can take, even if I'm not facilitating art classes directly. I'm, facilitating spaces looks like a lot of things. And I really needed this reminder of the breakdown of the different aspects that create the spaces that we're all in. So that just was a great reminder. And thank you, Sean. Thank you, Pastor. This was great.
Thank you. Okay, with that, you all have a great day. Thank you for being on, and we'll be in touch. Our 4th workshop, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Sean, is on curriculum development. Right?
That's right. No, thank you for picking that up. Yeah.
So we will be we will be looking deeper into our own curriculums, and we will be interrogating it through these lenses. I don't know.
And that'll be sometime in December. We'll of course reach out to everyone that has participated in the previous 3 workshops, the AJSC coalition workshops. And again, well ahead of time, we will be asking individuals to actually submit lesson plans so that we can collectively study them using the filters as Pastor said. So that'll be a great end to the year-long workshop. Right on. Be well, y'all. Have a great one.
Have a good day.